Most people think a crisis in the Middle East only matters when the number on the gas station sign jumps overnight. They see regular unleaded go up 30 cents, maybe 50, and think, this is annoying, but I'll deal with it. What they don't see is the part that hits later, the part that creeps into grocery bills, airline prices, monthly budgets, credit card balances, and even mortgage rates. And by the time they finally feel the full damage, it's already too late to prepare calmly. That is the real danger. Not just the oil shock itself, but the delay between the warning and the pain. Because when geopolitical tension rises around Iran and people start talking about the Strait of Hormuz, most Americans hear it as foreign policy or military strategy. It sounds distant, abstract, but that narrow waterway is one of the most important economic choke points on Earth. And if its flow is disrupted or even threatened, the effects do not stay there. They travel fast through energy markets, shipping costs, business expenses, inflation data, interest rate expectations, and eventually your day-to-day life. And here is the part most people miss. By the time the average person notices a real financial problem, the chain reaction is already underway. Gasoline is just the first billboard. The real story is what comes next, and why people tend to respond too late, underestimate the risk, and then overreact when fear takes over. That pattern matters because financial damage is rarely caused only by events. It is often multiplied by the way people interpret events. Two households can live through the same inflation shock, the same market drop, and the same jump in fuel prices and come out in very different positions. Not because one had perfect foresight, but because one understood how the problem spreads and how the mind makes bad decisions under pressure. So this is not just about oil. It is not just about war. And it is definitely not just about filling up your tank. When energy becomes more expensive, almost everything around you becomes more expensive in ways that are harder to spot, harder to time, and easier to mishandle emotionally. Think about how this usually plays out. The headline breaks. Tensions escalate. Markets get nervous. Oil prices spike because traders are pricing in the possibility of disrupted supply. At first, many people shrug. Maybe this will blow over. Maybe the media is exaggerating again. Nobody wants to panic over every headline. But then the gas station signs change. That's when people start paying attention, because gasoline is personal. It is visible. You can feel it in 10 seconds. And this is where the first psychological trap appears: mental accounting. Most people treat gasoline as its own little category in the mind. Gas got expensive, they think. That's the problem. So they complain about gas, maybe drive less for a week, and assume they've identified the threat. But gasoline isn't isolated. It is tied to transportation, logistics, food distribution, industrial production, airfare, delivery costs, and inflation expectations. Because the cost first appears in one familiar place, many people mentally contain the problem there. And that is exactly how they underestimate what is coming. Because the next hit usually does not arrive as dramatically as the first. It arrives quietly in the grocery store. A few cents more here, $1 more there. Nothing feels catastrophic on its own, which makes it easy to dismiss. But when fuel costs rise, the cost of moving food rises too. Trucks do not run on hope. Warehouses, suppliers, distributors, and retailers all face higher operating costs, and eventually those costs reach the consumer. And then comes the layer after that: fertilizers and agricultural inputs. This is where the timeline becomes deceptive. A lot of people think that if food prices didn't explode immediately, maybe the danger was overstated. But agriculture has lag effects. Higher energy costs can push up fertilizer production and transport, which means the food inflation you notice today may only be the beginning. This is why the most dangerous economic shocks often unfold in stages. Stage 1 is obvious. Stage 2 is annoying. Stage 3 is exhausting. And by stage 4, people are no longer making clean decisions. They are reacting. Now here's where things get more serious, because rising oil prices do not just hit drivers and grocery shoppers. They hit travelers too. Jet fuel costs matter. Airlines can hedge, adjust routes, add fees, or reprice tickets, but they do not absorb sustained fuel shocks forever. At some point, travelers feel it. And this matters because a lot of household budgets are built on emotional assumptions, not just numbers. People think gas is up, but we can still make the trip. Then airfare jumps. Hotel rates are already elevated. Rental cars are expensive. Suddenly, a plan that felt manageable becomes a bigger financial drain than expected. And instead of calmly adjusting in advance, many households charge the difference to a credit card. That, later, is where personal finance usually gets dangerous. Because the next piece of the chain reaction is not a price tag you see in a store. It is monetary policy. When energy prices rise enough to influence broader inflation, central bankers notice. If inflation stays stubborn, rate cuts can be delayed. And that means borrowing costs stay higher for longer. Car loans, credit cards, business financing, mortgages, home equity lines, everything tied to interest costs can remain painful. This is where the average person often feels blindsided. Why should conflict far away affect the interest rate on my debt here at home? But that is exactly how interconnected modern economies are. Energy shock feeds inflation. Inflation changes rate expectations. Rate expectations affect financial conditions. Financial conditions affect households. And if you're only watching gasoline, you're already behind the story. This is where anchoring bias quietly does damage. People anchor to the first visible number. They remember what gas used to cost 2 weeks ago, what eggs cost 3 months ago, what flight prices looked like last year, what mortgage rates were before. Because the mind clings to old reference points, many households keep behaving as if today's conditions are temporary noise rather than a shift they need to adapt to. So instead of changing spending early, they wait for normal to come back. They keep discretionary spending too high. They keep the emergency fund too thin. They postpone the uncomfortable cuts because part of their brain still believes prices will soon return to where they should be. But markets do not care where you anchored, and neither does inflation. Then comes loss aversion, which may be the most powerful force in the whole story. Human beings hate losses more than they enjoy equivalent gains. During a geopolitical crisis, that can turn a difficult situation into a self-inflicted disaster. At first, loss aversion keeps people from accepting reality. They do not want to lose their current lifestyle, so they resist cutting spending. They tell themselves it's temporary. But later, when the pain becomes undeniable, that same loss aversion flips into panic. Now they cannot stand seeing portfolio losses. They cannot stand the fear of future price increases. So they overreact. This is how people end up making 3 mistakes in sequence. First, they ignore early signs. Then they delay rational adjustments. Then they panic after the damage has spread. And this is why the real risk is not just inflation. It is delayed interpretation followed by bad behavior. Look at investing during moments like this. Markets hate uncertainty. War risk, oil spikes, inflation fears, delayed rate cuts, slower growth, all of that can pressure stocks. Headlines get louder. Every red day feels like the beginning of something bigger. And a huge number of investors suddenly feel an urge that seems logical. Maybe I should get out now and come back later when things feel safer. That impulse feels intelligent because it feels protective. But panic selling during periods of fear has punished ordinary investors again and again. Not because declines are impossible, but because the people who sell in the middle of the storm rarely buy back at the right time. They wait for reassurance. They wait for clarity. And by the time it feels safe, much of the recovery has already happened. This is one of the cruelest truths in investing. The market often begins to recover before the news feels better, which means the very emotion that makes people want to sell also makes them likely to miss the rebound. That matters right now more than ever. Because an energy shock tied to geopolitical conflict creates a special kind of emotional pressure. It feels external, unpredictable, and dangerous. You cannot control it. That lack of control intensifies bad decisions. People want to do something. Sell, freeze, cancel investments, hoard cash. But activity is not the same as wisdom. Sometimes the most expensive decision is doing something dramatic just to relieve emotional discomfort. Now let's go deeper, because there's another layer most people do not notice until it hurts. second-order and third-order effects. The first-order effect is obvious. Oil goes up, gasoline rises. Fine. But the second-order effect is that businesses start dealing with higher input costs. The third-order effect is that those businesses change pricing, hiring, inventory, and investment decisions. And then households experience the outcome not as one clean shock, but as a messy combination of expensive essentials, weaker confidence, tighter credit, and more financial stress. A family might notice the gas bill immediately, but not realize that their weekly grocery increase is connected. They might notice airfare is worse, but treat it as unrelated. They might notice their credit card interest is still brutal, but blame only their own debt. But financially, these are not isolated annoyances. They are pieces of the same broader stress pattern. And when you misread the pattern, you mismanage the response. For example, imagine two households earning roughly the same income. The first sees higher gas prices and thinks, annoying, but manageable. They keep spending normally. They carry credit card balances. When groceries rise more, they feel squeezed. When flights get more expensive, they use more debt. When markets fall, they panic and stop investing. By the end of the year, they have less cash, more anxiety, and a portfolio strategy driven by fear. The second household sees the same early signs and understands the chain reaction. They do not panic, but they get honest fast. They trim low-value spending before it feels urgent. They add to the emergency fund. They review debt exposure. They keep long-term investments going if their time horizon supports it. They prepare before the full shock arrives. By the end of the year, they may still be uncomfortable, but they are far less fragile. Same economy, same headlines, different interpretation, different behavior, different result. So what do you actually do if tensions rise, oil jumps, and the risk of broader inflation grows? First, reinforce your emergency fund. A stronger cash buffer gives you choices. It lets you absorb higher bills without immediately falling into debt or liquidating investments at a bad moment. Second, cut weak spending before stronger cuts become necessary. Not everything enjoyable should be cut, but everything automatic should be questioned. Convenience spending, forgotten subscriptions, impulse purchases, underused memberships. This is where flexibility can be created. Third, examine how dependent your lifestyle is on energy. Long commutes, large vehicles, frequent flights, and spending habits built around convenience can make a household unusually vulnerable to oil-related shocks. Fourth, do not let a market drop trick you into abandoning long-term investing if your plan was sound to begin with. Separate strategy from emotion. Fifth, be careful with major finance purchases during periods when energy-driven inflation may keep rates elevated. Debt-heavy decisions become more expensive when borrowing relief does not arrive as quickly as people expected. And here's a question almost nobody asks at the right time. What is the cost of being financially late? Because that is what happens to many households during shocks like this. They're not permanently clueless. They just adapt after the chain reaction has already spread. They trim spending after months of waste. They build cash after stress is already high. They stop using debt after balances have already grown. They rethink investing after panic has already damaged results. Financially, being 6 months late can hurt more than being slightly imperfect from the beginning. This is why I keep coming back to psychology. Mental accounting makes people isolate gasoline from the wider inflation story. Anchoring bias makes them budget emotionally for a cheaper past that no longer exists. Loss aversion makes them refuse small, rational adjustments early and then lunge into larger, irrational decisions later. The people who navigate financial turbulence best are usually not the people with the most dramatic opinions about the crisis. They're the people who understand the lag. They understand that economic pain moves through stages, that visible prices are only the first signal, and that a calm response early is usually worth far more than a dramatic response late. That is the mindset shift. The real threat is not simply that a geopolitical crisis can make life more expensive. The real threat is that the human mind is wired to notice the wrong thing first, dismiss what is less visible, cling to old reference points, and then make fear-based decisions when the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Once that clicks, a lot changes. You stop asking only, how bad is gas going to get? And start asking, what else becomes vulnerable if energy costs stay high? You stop saying, I'll adjust later if I need to, and start asking, what adjustments are easiest now before pressure increases? You stop treating investing as a mood-driven activity and start seeing discipline as protection against your future emotional self. Preparation does not require certainty. You do not need to know whether the Strait of Hormuz will fully close, partially disrupt, or simply remain a source of elevated tension. You do not need a perfect oil forecast. You only need to understand the range of consequences well enough to reduce your fragility. You are not trying to become a geopolitical analyst. You're trying to become less easy to damage. Maybe that means carrying more cash for a while. Maybe it means adjusting commuting habits. Maybe it means delaying an optional purchase. Maybe it means finally paying off the toxic balance you kept rationalizing. Maybe it means recommitting to automatic investing so your emotions have fewer chances to interfere. Because economic stress does not usually arrive as one clean disaster. It arrives as friction, then more friction, then accumulated strain. A little more at the pump, a little more at the store, a little more on tickets, a little more on financing, a little more in the market, a little more anxiety in the background. So no, this is not just a story about gasoline. It is a story about economic transmission. It is a story about invisible delays. It is a story about how global tension becomes household pressure. And most of all, it is a story about how the mind often betrays people before the numbers do. But that also means there is good news hidden inside all of this. If behavior magnifies damage, behavior can also reduce it. If delayed interpretation is dangerous, early awareness is valuable. If panic selling destroys long-term progress, disciplined investing protects it. If old anchors distort judgment, new, honest budgeting restores clarity. So remember the sequence. Oil shock is not the end of the story. It is often the beginning. First gas, then food through transportation costs, then more food pressure later through agricultural inputs, then airfare through jet fuel, then borrowing costs through inflation pressure and delayed rate relief. And running through all of it is the human tendency to underestimate the spread, notice it late, and react emotionally. If you remember that chain, you are already ahead of the average reaction. And if you act on it calmly, you may protect far more than your monthly gas budget. You may protect your liquidity, your peace of mind, your investment future, and your ability to make smart decisions while others are being pushed around by fear. That is the real lesson here. The biggest financial danger in a geopolitical energy crisis is not simply that prices go up. It is that people misread the timeline, focus only on the most visible pain, and then make bigger mistakes when the broader consequences finally hit. And that is how ordinary people create extraordinary financial resilience.